People are complicated. No, this is a non-trivial kind of thing. It's like people wonder why NLP doesn't come up with one technique that works for everything. No, and if there was one technique, do you know which one it would be? It might be the pattern. And why would that, Anne? If there was one technique, and NLP, people have asked us, why can't you just teach one technique? And I said, okay, well, if we ever reduce the field to one technique, we'll teach it in an afternoon. Well, of course, we'll charge you the same amount as for the whole month, but we'll teach it in an afternoon. And in the evening, we'll have a big party. But I think if there is one technique, it is the swish pattern. Because what does the swish pattern do? It unconsciously organizes your resources to go for an idealized future self, dissociative image, that is cued by the onset of the difficulty. So basically, it's this, anytime there's an onset of a difficulty, is to go through all the possibilities you have, which will take you closer to that outcome. What is it? It's a strategy. I mean, you may not be aware of it, but every technique in NLP is a strategy. Strategy for how to overcome criticism, a strategy for how to be creative, a strategy for how to remember, a strategy for making a decision, a strategy for orienting yourself in a generative way towards your future. Now, it does not address belief, the swish pattern does not address beliefs, and it is of the order, which is very interesting to me, of an iterative, generative process. In other words, you would eventually build the strategies, processes, resources you needed. And in an adult where you have a lot of history, that can happen fairly rapidly. On the other hand, why wait? No, if you know that it's a decision-making process that needs to be revised, then go directly to revising that rather than doing something that might get to it eventually, kind of thing. Yeah, so people are complicated, so we have many ways to intervene. And it's, of course, the purpose for a model. Because a model is simpler than that complication and allows you to look at it in terms of a number of limited and discrete elements where you can go, well, is it this? Is it this? Is it this? And you go, well, okay, and it's probably over here. I noticed that a number of you had very interesting sessions. Anybody want to comment on any of those? Sure, Eric.
When they listened to my strategy in the beginning, they missed the auditory. In other words, it was only a VK, and they missed the A part of it. So that would, without going back and making sure that they had elicited the strategy well in the beginning, would have been hard to help me make a correction to my more difficult situation.
Okay, and the lesson you gleaned from this?
Make sure you elicit the VAK, that there are always three steps in a strategy, at least, VAK.
You mean 3 elements?
3 elements.
Okay. So a matter of being willing to open up, attune to what's going on, and as I've suggested, having another person there, very different. Bandler suggested early on, when I discussed modeling with him, that your modeling partner should be as different from you as you can possibly stand. Now, this is a testament not only to triangulating on something, but the idea of different metaprograms. That if you're very different kinds of people, that you're going to have a different experience of that. And by the way, having done this a few times, you also develop a greater appreciation for a different perspective. Has a nice side effect. One of the groups I want to point out had the experience of realizing that what they were doing was not really a decision strategy. That, as I said earlier, the decision strategy was in response to something else. In case I'm thinking of, was where there was a sense of wanting to develop a decision strategy in order to overcome boredom. Now, what's boredom? feeling. And what happens, what if you're just a little bored? Well, if you're an American, you turn on the TV. But so you're a little bored. You just go about what you're doing. Now you get really bored. And you get rid of it, yes. But we get rid of, get away from. Oh, it's away from. So we have a threshold of boredom that we then need to get away from. So if we looked at it in terms of the different strategies, that what started as a decision strategy question really turned out to be a motivation strategy problem. In other words, the decision was in reaction to firing a negative motivation. And keeping it on the same level, the question was, what can I do to relieve boredom? Now, given what my brain I go to, and what kind of life would that lead to? You get this kind of thing as bored, get away from boredom, distraction, 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 bored, get away from boredom. And I'm going, this is not really going to be that interesting. So I went in and did what vis-a-vis what you saw with Rick. I made a suggestion. Remember what we did with Rick? We went to, it's here somewhere. We went to higher criteria. So what I did is I leveraged the boredom. Now there was something else going on. I'm doing this to give you an idea of how these fit together. There was something else going on, which was that when you're picking something to relieve boredom, well, use criteria, of course. And what?
Strategy.
Will this relieve my boredom? Will this relieve my boredom? It's not very discriminating criteria. It's a big world. Right. If you've got a big world and you have a lot of options, you need to reduce your option set. You know, on a decision strategy, you need to generate options. But what if you've walked into a movie store? Or what if you've walked into the toyland of life and you're looking around and your only criteria are, I want to relieve boredom? You're still going to have too many choices. Whereas if you say, well, it's still got to relieve boredom. Now, why would we leave that in the negative? Because you don't shift meta programs. I'm getting just a little ahead of myself here, but a little preview. Since he has a well-developed away from, you want to utilize that, not ignore it. In other words, this is different than re-anchoring. Remember, a meta program is made up of distinctions. This person has a lot of distinctions about boredom. They know what a little boredom is and more boredom. They know what angst boredom is. They know what relationship boredom is, sexual boredom. I'm sure there's a lot of distinctions there about boredom. Right? So you don't want to not utilize that. You want to use it. So you want to say, okay, it's going to relieve boredom, and then you can do what? You can develop the toward. Right. You can begin to say, and what else would you want it to do that would make your life such that you wouldn't be considering boredom? I mean, what is boredom signaling you about? You're not living a worthwhile life. Now, I was playing, but what it was is you begin to move up a hierarchy of criteria. You could even, if you wanted to, relate it to the DILTS levels and say that on a behavioral level, he can be a little bored, viscerally. Oh, I'm feeling bored. And he has a strategy for avoiding boredom. But what we want to do is appeal to higher criteria to begin to orient a life direction. And so, again, you see how these begin to fit together. Remember I said that strategies are fractal, right? That is that you can have a strategy for what your appetizer is tonight. You can have a strategy about how to spend your evening, how to spend the week up here, your vacation, who to marry. In other words, bigger and bigger totes. Same thing is criteria is fractal. That you can have criteria for the flavor of your coffee or your juice in the morning. You can have criteria for a well-executed golf swing or whether or not you're having a pleasant walk in the evening. You can have criteria for how good your decision strategy is and what kind of results you're getting. And you have criteria, higher criteria in the Dilts model here, on different aspects of your life. How's my career going? How is my direction? How is my relationships? Which is typically how people use criteria. But they're found at all the levels. So when we talk about a hierarchy of criteria is moving up to the point that the criteria addresses a larger and larger area of the person's life. And so that group had a little bit of fun, encouraging that the person begin to expand and look at how something as simple as relieving boredom could in fact be an impetus for having a better life. This is generative change. And interestingly, from our standpoint, a strategy standpoint, it's not a top-down, but a bottom-up. In other words, building the kind of strategies that encourage a person to want to develop more and more of a good life, a great life for themselves, and that over time, every time they make a decision, every time the person relieves boredom, swish pattern again, they can be moving towards more of the overall life they want. Here you're setting a mechanism, a machine in motion that delivers more of what the person wants. Does that make sense?
Could you say more about the top-down and bottom-up?
Well, this is Dilts' model of levels. He takes to be in some way a hierarchical model. There are reasons why it isn't. I don't need to go into those now. But in a hierarchical model, you get what are called downward causation. In other words, if the metaphor at the top, a person has, I'm an explorer, for example, then the metaphor of life, and the identity is equivalence. The person, I think of myself as an explorer. Then the kinds of values and beliefs they're likely to bring to bear on a situation will be those that have to do with exploration. The kinds of strategies they'll activate will have to do with exploration, and the kinds of behaviors that they'll engage in. So there's a downward causation, if you will. Give you a contrary to that, if the person thinks of them as life as a game. Now, if they think of life as a game, metaphorically, this means there's some sort of a player in the game, there are winners and losers, and consequently, again, certain values will come into play, certain strategies will be activated, certain behaviors will be engaged that would not be engaged necessarily if you think life is exploration. And so on for any number of other metaphors, and this work's available in my own metaphor work in various forms. So that's, in a hierarchical system, that's a downward causation. People are typically used to that the higher level, if you believe you can do it, you'll engage in behaviors to do it idea. But there's also, it goes the other way, which is called emergent properties. That if you engage in behaviors, that Erickson was famous for this, that he would find a different way to go home. So he'd be seeing a client across town, and he'd get in his car, and he'd start driving, and he'd take a random right and a random left, or a left and a left and a right and a right, or whatever, and he'd end up where he didn't know where he was. So he was behaviorally giving himself a very simple instruction to get lost and then find his way. And he began, this caused Erickson, I would say, to build all sorts of creativity strategies. He was very good at finding his way through the complexity of people's lives because for him, being lost didn't have the emotional responses that other people have to it. It's like, I'm lost? Wow, that's a whole new thing, And so he was giving himself all sorts of new experiences. He was encouraging himself to build different kinds of strategies. And this built up certain life attitudes. So you get an emergent property effect instead. This is the same kind of thing that they talk about if you teach a kid who's has attitude problems, as they call them, about school. And, well, let me give you my own experience, is that I taught for a while in a weekend program for refugees immigrating to the U.S. They had a number of young men who had, shall we say, behavior problems. They couldn't speak the language properly. They were not treated as equals in the school. They already came from an environment that valued violent responses over reasoned responses. So I'm to tutor these guys. It's like, oh, great. But it was like, I sat down with them and I said, how'd you like to learn this material quickly so that you could go to school, get your homework done, get good grades, and still have time to goof off and drive your teachers crazy? They said, sign me up. So I remember what I was doing is I was teaching, I showed you before the thing about anchoring and anchoring auditory onto visual things. Well, I was teaching them grammar visually. And so I had like a bottle top and a key and a paper clip and some other things. And I'm teaching them passive voice by just moving these things around. It comes from a thing called the silent way. And I'm showing them, I'm teaching them how to do this so that they can learn the passive voice really quickly. And so I'm teaching them a strategy for learning grammar, that they could do it. And in like 10 minutes, they could do it. And in doing that, at the same time, I'd already loaded up what I said with, it's not that you're not smart, it's that the schools don't know how to teach this. And so when they learned how to manipulate active to passive voice, so the example, I still remember the example was, I don't know why they use this example, crocodiles eat daffodils. That was the example. It was in the textbook, I swear. And it became, daffodils are eaten by crocodiles. Right, and I taught them how to generate multiple sets, and they got it, it was easy. That had a generative effect upward, because then it was like, oh, I am smart. These teachers just know how to teach me how to do it. Not only that, now I can get the homework done 10 minutes in study hall, and I can still goof off. So when the teachers go, hey, stop goofing off, do your homework, go, hey, done. And I'm pleased to say a number of these students, they went on to technical school and university there because, in fact, they were smart. They just had certain attitudes, beliefs that they were picking up from the environment, from the system, that were encouraging them in a direction, and instead it was utilizing a strategy to make a belief change. See, this is easy once you understand this. Once you understand you want to associate certain things, that there can be effects in either direction. You're welcome.
We understand it, but we don't know how to apply it. It's myself. I
Well-
understood what you're saying, but how would I apply it?
So guess what's coming tomorrow? We're going to do belief change tomorrow, but a different way. So let's take a look here. We can look at decision strategies as having particular kinds of difficulties that you can notice based on what the person describes their difficulty as. If somebody either says, I'm a divided mind, or shows it, then you know the kind of way to intervene. If somebody tells you life's the same old, I wish something new would happen in my life. Or if the person says, I have all these opportunities, I just can't decide between them, then you know about stepping in and out, developing that. Buyer's remorse, very similar to the divided mind. We've been over all of these examples given in practice. Another one that tends to affect these others is when the person has a modal operator of necessity in their strategy. This can be verbalized, as in, you must decide now, shit or get off the pot in American vernacular, or it can be implied, Ron, the waitress is waiting. Right, and it doesn't just happen there, it happens across life, and more often, of course, people do this to themselves. And this is where you've got a have to, must, you should, decide now kind of thing going on in your strategy. As I say, it tends to just feed on these other ones because the person already, they don't have options or they can't decide, and then they're told they must decide because it'll be real helpful. It's not. So I don't know, does anyone have anything like that?
I'm not sure if I have that, or, something in the past kind of, it's
Mhm.
like, I was faced with a relocation on a job.
Yeah.
And basically, I was offered the opportunity to relocate or not.
Mm-hmm.
If I didn't relocate, then of course I was out of work. If I did relocate, then I was still at work.
Right. That's exactly that kind of thing. So this also can apply generally. I mean, am I the only person that ever had a voice inside that would tell me things that weren't entirely pleasant? You have to do this, you must do that. Okay, I'm the only one. All right. So So let me show you what I did, and the rest of you, you can just pretend like it's not happening to you and just go along with it, okay? All right. Is that if you take a moment and listen around inside, not everyone, but a number of people tend to have a voice that tells them things, usually not in a very pleasant tonality. It helps you find which voice it is. It's the one that goes, it's like you ever walked all the way home arguing with somebody and they weren't there? Yeah, that one. So the first thing is to locate, is that voice more on this side of your head or that side of your head? It's interesting, it's almost always behind you to some extent. And it's even curious, if you just take the voice on the end of your fingers and pull it out in front and talk to it. Okay, now talk to me. That often changes things right there. This has to do with location. However, if you let go of it, it goes back. So when you've noticed which side it's more on, we're talking about a voice that you would like to find out if it ever really had a positive intent or not, because it sure doesn't sound like it does, is allow it to begin to roll down whichever shoulder it's closest to. And I'm going to just pick my left one here, but it can be either one for you. And as it crosses over the elbow, allow the voice to change and become more and more like a cartoon voice. Of course, due to copyright infringement, I can't say which cartoon it is, but you can decide. So eventually, by the time it gets to your palm, it's saying the same things, but in a cartoon voice. You should really make a decision. You must know. Decide now. Now. Well, the thing you'll notice is that your feeling about it has changed. This is due to the fact that in submodalities, the more variables you change in the experiences in the submodalities, the less likely it is to have the same anchored response. In other words, you had the idea when the voice was disturbing, it has to be back here and talk in a certain but when it gets down here, different location, then your brain doesn't sort it the same way. Now, at this point, a lot of people just want to go like this, right? But don't. No, what I want you to do is, what's down here? What's down here? Is to find out what the positive intent is. Because since you're in a different relationship, it becomes a lot more possible. Of course, it's still that finding out, I'm here to protect you. Right? Something like that. Now, this obviously draws on reframing, yeah? And whatever you find out down here, what you can do when you're ready is to allow the voice to begin to come up the arm, but before it reaches the elbow, you're going to have decided which very appealing voice it's going to sound like. Now, for some people, this might be a sexy voice. For some people, this might be a foreign accent. For some people, it might mean it's slower like I'm doing. For other people, it might be voice, James' voice. Whatever it is for you, by the time it gets past your elbow, it has this really wonderful tonality that you like to listen to. If this person called you up about selling magazines, you'd be afraid, very afraid, because you'd say yes to all the magazines they wanted you to buy. That kind of quality of voice. Now, you might notice as it gets up to the top of your shoulder that it's beginning to sound very different in your experience. It's not even saying the same things, is it? This different tone has somehow brought out a whole different content. And this again goes to the idea of the structure of experience, that we change the way the voice sounds and the content changes. So it may find a different place to settle in. You too can figure out what that place might be. No, I did that rather quickly. You can certainly do that more thoroughly on your own. The idea being that by making that shift, you're allowing there to be a shift in the content of the experience. It's interesting is that some of these voices, they're beginning to find out there are actually parts of the brain associated with them. And I talk in other trainings about the interpreter, the part of the brain that interprets what we do and gives coherence to our experience, which turns out to be a very essential part of our experience. Also, having another part of you watching out for you, but doing so in a voice tone you appreciate, can be very, very useful. So now, instead of it being a feeling forced, it's like having an internal advisor. And that, shifting from a modal operator of necessity to perhaps a modal operator of possibility. You could do this, you could do that. You might want to watch out for this. This looks like a good opportunity. Still fulfilling the same function as before. Questions on that? Well, we're going to get to that. We're just right here.
No, up. Criteria, yes, here. Criteria.
Criteria spread across the
spread,
strategy. Yeah. We went through that one, yeah.
Oh, we have to
Bring it to the front.
To the front.
Yeah, to give you the mapping I did before, criteria gets spread across these steps, the operation. What you want to do is gather it up and put it in the test so that when you start the strategy, you're considering all the criteria, and then you're utilizing these to generate options, not to find criteria. So people go to the store and they go, oh, that's nice, and then they feel it and go, oh, I like it, and then they look at the price tag, like, oh, then what they've done is bang, bang, bang. They've like sold themselves, now they've unsold themselves. Whereas if you got at the very top, you went, okay, I want this kind of chair, I want this kind of feel, I want this kind of price. And then you went in the shop and you looked at it and you go, oh, wrong price. Well, maybe I can talk to the person, maybe make a deal. But very different attitude emerges. Because then you can go, don't want it. Or you can adjust your criteria at that point, but you know you're doing it, as opposed to getting into an internal conflict. Yeah. This goes to the idea of criterion evidence, which is a whole world of material. I refer you again to Leslie Cameron Bandler's and other, Michael LeBeau, David Gordon's Know-How. I refer you to David Gordon and Mary Beth Meyer Anderson's Phoenix, studies of Erickson's working criteria. We've just touched on this, the idea of inappropriate criteria. What are the 4 food groups? The idea of insufficient criteria. The idea that the example with avoiding boredom, simply not having enough criteria to reduce the world of possibilities enough. The idea of conflicting criteria. That people often get conflicted in criteria because they think that, well, this is important and that's important. They don't have a hierarchy. And last and not least, the sequence of criteria. Let me give you an example. How many of you want to do something worthwhile with your life? I know, only me. How many of you want to do something fun? How often do these come into conflict? Now, reverse the sequence. How many of you want to do something fun with your life? Now, begin to think of all the fun things that you could do. It's all right, I won't tell. No, just start thinking of all the fun things you could do. You know? It can be Las Vegas fun, it can be Florida fun, it can be, any kind of fun you want to think of. I won't tell. So you're thinking of all this, just start generating fun. And when you've got that going, then are making a contribution. Well, the idea being that if you want to live worthwhile life, make a contribution kind of thing, and you put that first, there's a lot of things you can do to make a contribution, live a worthwhile life that are really serious. They aren't fun, or at least we don't interpret them that way. But if you turn it the other way and you go, what are all the fun things that I could do? And then which of those are worthwhile and make a contribution? Then the sequence allows you to pull out, and you've already sorted for an important criteria. Some of you are sitting there thinking about this, and it's a good idea because you clearly haven't before. People can get themselves in a lot of trouble, again, without even knowing it's a structural problem. After all, if it's fun, you're going to do more of it, and you're going to get good at it. So if you're looking at all the fun stuff you could do, and I mean all the fun stuff you could do, then you begin to sort in what really makes a contribution that I appreciate, what would make a difference in the world that I would like, then you can add in those other ones, and you go, well, this one would, and that one would, and that one would. And you can begin to generate possibilities that you'd both really enjoy doing and would meet other criteria. This is about the sequencing of criteria. Yeah.
This is maybe backing up a little bit, but I think it still fits, is that oftentimes I find myself going out to stores to amuse myself.
Sure.
Okay, so I'll go into...
They're very happy you're doing that.
Yeah, exactly, because I get attracted to these things,
Mm-hmm.
and I look at it, and I touch it, and I feel it, and I like it, and everything, and I let the price, in a way, there's a certain strategy I have when I look at the price, and I see it, and I say, no, don't have money right now, I'll put it aside, come back and get it later, or something like that. It's almost like a strategy to where I allow that price to be the thing that puts it off, because it's not something that I plan to do,
Mm-hmm.
but it's satisfying an amusement thing in my mind.
Well, 45% of all mall purchases are impulse. Yeah. They design malls that way. Of course, then I would want to tell you the story of the Taoist and the emperor. And the Taoist, as you know, they walk around, they've got their little water bottle and their cane and their cloak, and that's all. But they're religious people, they're hermits and so forth, and so the emperor invited this Taoist over, and they spent the evening, and this emperor collected jewels. And they spent the evening drinking wine and looking at the jewels, admiring the jewels. And the emperor had a great jewel collection. Diamonds and emeralds and rubies and all. And at the end of the evening, the Taoist said, "Thank you for giving me your jewels." And the emperor, though he'd had a little bit to drink, said, "No, excuse me, I didn't give you the jewels. They're staying." And the Taoist said, "But what more joy can you get from them than I just did? And on top of that, you have all the things about protecting them from thieves and having to defend them and keep them. Whereas I will always have the wonderful memory of the jewels." Criteria. Yeah, very significant area that there's more and more to do in. So we have been looking at the details of the structure of decision strategies. And some of you have already slipped into some of the other strategies. That some had a decision to relieve motivation. We had another interesting example in one of the groups where instead of it actually being a decision strategy, it was a misapplied learning strategy. So now we begin to roll into an advanced area of strategies you're not going to get anywhere else, which is that the strategies all use the tote, but they use it in different ways. That there are different kinds of strategies based on the way they handle information, what could be called their information type. So far, we spent a good deal of time on decision, motivation, and conviction strategies. In addition to that, what are the other strategies? Okay, there's a learning strategy. There's a what? Spelling strategy would be, no, memory strategy. It's a class of memory strategy, right? Because you're trying to remember how something was spelled before. It's no different than remembering your friend when they come in the room. What would be another one? Creativity. How would you know about that? And a planning strategy?
That would be a decision strategy.
Planning strategy would be creativity combined with a decision strategy, yes. And? Well, that is it, but I want people to experience that that's it.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm open to having another one put on the list. Everything I've looked at fits into one of these 7, and there's 7 different information types. Procrastination is not a strategy. Procrastination is the incompleteness of a strategy.
So building beliefs would fall into conviction.
That kind of belief. There are a number of ways to build beliefs. You can build a belief by a traumatic experience. You can build a belief by an imprint. You can build a belief by presupposition. You can build a belief by implication. You can also, you can also build a belief by running a convincer strategy or a conviction strategy, yes. A conviction strategy has the advantage of actually being sensory-based, as you built it out of a number of examples.
So when you use the word strategies, are you thinking of conscious?
A sequence, that's good, thanks Rick. A strategy by NLP definition is a sequence of representations, internal and external, leading to an outcome. A sequence of representations, because we don't actually get anything, we only get the representations, internal and or external, leading to an outcome. That's the definition of a strategy. Yes?
At risk of throwing, being the devil's advocate.
Sure.
Why isn't procrastination a strategy?
Because you don't actually get, see, procrastination is not your outcome. It isn't that you want to procrastinate. It's that you've got, well, basically procrastination is competing strategies. It's competing outcomes. So you don't get to certain outcomes for certain other outcomes, and then you get to feel bad about it, and then you try to apply another strategy, but actually you're bored, so then you try to motivate yourself. So it just gloms stuff together.
Wouldn't it be a strategy for being unhappy?
Yes, but do you want to be unhappy? Is that the outcome?
I was just thinking of what you said before when you talked about a strategy for unhappiness.
Mm-hmm.
And in the rigorous definition, NLP definition, I was just wondering about that.
No, I was speaking in a more metaphoric way about the idea that people can be unhappy for these reasons. Think it's the same old thing, feel divided, and they can identify with that and think that there's something in them that's wrong, right? And then they add that on top. Then they do a meta strategy on that. Then they make a negative, I can never decide, so I'm a person who never decides, so I'm a bad person, and get themselves, sense gummed up. When I'm suggesting in this work, you can really dissociate from that and go, you have a machine, you have a mechanism called strategies, and we can pick it apart, we can rebuild it, you can take the pieces that work, because everyone has pieces that work, streamline it, and it's not you at all.
So by definition, you're saying that a strategy is something that works to get an outcome.
Yes, a series
So
of
the question
internal
would
and
be-
external representations leading to an outcome.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes?
What is reality strategy?
Okay, let's go down these now then. Decision strategies have the function of generating options and then deciding among them, reducing the generation of options to a choice. Motivation strategies have the function of creating enough impetus, emotional, whatever, so to threshold, to action. Conviction strategies have the function of counting in either time or in number the examples necessary to generate a generalization. A learning strategy, as I'm using it here, is to take a set of distinctions and to move it to another context. So the example I gave earlier of the bicycle rider who then utilizes that to apply to driving is an example of a learning strategy. That learning to ride a tricycle or learning something. Now this is different in adults than children. In children, you're actually learning the neurological networks, if you will. As an adult, you're for the most part recontextualizing them. So if you look at the work of Erickson, a lot of it is how you take a learning from one area of your life and apply it to another. So he would have examples that included the man who was in pain. And he said, well, if you were in the hot sun, would you feel the pain? And the guy goes, well, no. And so he starts talking about the man's tomato plants, which are in the hot sun, and then sun's absorbing, the tomato plant's absorbing all the sunlight, and you feel it on the leaves, and the man's relaxing and relaxing and feeling less pain. As Erickson was teaching him, take the learnings that you did about laying in the sun, sitting in the sun, and apply them to this context. The idea of taking the learnings, a story I told of the guy who was living in a ditch, and Erickson convinces him that he should take dance lessons to learn to be a better gardener, right? So the guy is learning rhythmic motions so he can go garden, but then he goes and applies that to dancing, and this convinces him he's an all right guy, recontextualizing learnings. Memory. Memory is the ability to test your input against what you have stored, your eidetic. It turns out, and this is particularly found in the work of Michael Gazzaniga, is that in some sense all memory is made up. We don't actually have a computer storage for that. We have to put together the neural net of a previous memory. And then how much that neural net matches what we see or what we feel, what we hear, we go, yeah, I remember it. This is often why people have different memories, and also the experiments that myself and I know a number of other trainers regale you with, where they have an accident and they show people a film of the accident, and they say, who got out of the back seat of the green car? And you tell them, but it turns out there was no green car, there was no back seat, that people's memories are fairly easy to affect. But we still have ways of recreating the same neural nets as before, and they have a certain familiar feeling, or they have a certain familiarity in look, and they tend to be stored in a certain way in the brain, so we can see it in the eye movements. Yes? Michael Gazzaniga. I'll give you the reference. A creativity strategy is to generate new options. This specifically has to do with accessing the constructed or creative, we'd say, side. This means the part of the brain that makes up things a person hasn't seen before, makes up things a person hasn't heard before. A reality strategy, finally, is how we know what's real and what's not, which is based, for the most part, for most people, on distinctiveness. This is why, if I can use that term in this training, your images inside your head aren't as sharp and bright as the ones on the outside. This is your brain's way of saying, if you see a truck and it's really vivid and clear, don't step in front of it. If it's kind of fuzzy and unclear, maybe it's in your head. No, people come up to me after a training and they'll go, well, my images in my head, when I close my eyes, I can't see my goals as clear as when my eyes are open. And I go, well, that's good. If you could, it's called psychosis. And people who can't tell their internal images and their external images. I know people that have what one would call photographic memories. And even they have ways of telling that their internal imagery is not the same as their external imagery. So they know which one to pay attention to. If there's, if something's going weird, if something's getting weird in the one that's clearer and brighter, they do something about it. The only real deep exception I know to this, who I wish was alive, is Tesla, who would create, Tesla, if anyone doesn't know, he's actually the guy that devised AC current. Because DC current batteries, it dissipates really quickly. You could never build an electrical system out of it, despite Edison, wanting to. It was Tesla, who didn't make very much money from this, who figured out alternating current. I figure he was an alien. And he also figured out ball lightning. And he also had a telephone system where you put a stake in the ground in New Jersey. Somebody else put a stake in the ground in Manhattan. They talked to each other. Yeah, and you're using a cell phone. So this guy could build a device in his head, run it for 6 months, and then test the calibrators and tell you how much it had worn. And one time they did a test against an actual device, and he was right. Now, that's an extreme of this. But even Tesla knew when he was talking to Mark Twain and when he was talking to himself. So, reality strategies, distinctiveness. Creativity strategies, developing new options. Memory strategies, being able to test a previous neural net against current experience and finding out, is this how I remember it? Learning strategy, recontextualizing learnings you already have. Conviction strategy, generating generalizations. Motivation strategies, thresholds to action. Decision strategies, generating choices, picking the one that you want to act on now. Each of the contents that you learn in strategies are examples. So somebody's spelling strategy is an example of a memory strategy. A name remembering strategy is an example of a memory strategy. Does that make sense? Yes. Well, the difference between motivation and decision is motivation is getting a threshold to action. You know, when it gets hot enough, you get out of the sun. Or when you're bored enough, you actually go out and do something. When you realize that you could have a better life, you know, in other words, it's an analog threshold. Decision strategies are more digital. Decision strategy is about generating a number of options and then finding out which one fulfills most of your criteria now. Well, there's a threshold in every decision because it has to meet the comparison. In other words, is this meal I'm going to order, does it describe enough of what would please me that I'll order it, or do I find something else? But explicitly in a motivation strategy, people are trying to reach a threshold. Procrastination often being an example of an unmet threshold, where the person, you know, they simply aren't scared enough or aren't being given enough goodies to actually want to go into action. Now, we're taking this as a prelude to tomorrow, where we're going to combine strategies and meta-programs. That is, there are certain meta-programs that come into play in certain strategies, and knowing that and being able to utilize that will allow you then to realize that very often the difficulty people get themselves in is analogical to this kind of situation. That is that they've got a structural problem, which is easy to fix once you know what the structure is. For example, procrastination. Now, we're not the first people, that is we in NLP, to notice that the content may not be the deal. It may be the structure. It may be the container. A number of you know I'm what might be called a bibliophile, if that's still something legal to be. And probably one of the oddest books in my library, I bought it in a little bookshop. And I was told actually I couldn't open it, but being me, I opened it. And there was only like the first 12 pages was this story. And the next 250 were blank. And on the last page of this book, because of course I look at the first and last page when I'm buying a book, it said, if this book were 100 times its price, it would still be cheap. So I figured it was a bargain. Couldn't figure out why all those pages were blank. So I bought it, and I took it home, and I opened it. And it starts out about a man who goes into a bookshop to buy a book. And they won't let him look in the book. But the man buys the book and he takes it home. And he opens the book. And there's a story about a wise man who lived in a kingdom and always gave tremendously good advice. It was an older man. And being that time, it was a man, of course. And his advice would cause families to reconcile, entrepreneurs to become rich, and other people, farmers, to till their fields at the proper time. And so he drew many, many students. And as time went by and the number of students grew, there became concern that the old man would die without imparting how he knew this stuff. And so one day there appeared in front of him this great thick book. And it had engraving on it and it had a great lock on it, gold lock that held it shut. And the old man had the key around his neck, and each morning he'd unlock it and open it up. And somebody would ask him a question, and he'd flip through the pages, and he'd look up and he'd answer the question. And then somebody else, and he'd flip back or flip through the other pages, and he'd pause for a moment, and then he'd look up and he'd answer the other person's question. And at the end of the day, he'd lock the book, and then the book would be taken by his students and locked into a safe. Well, the students were greatly relieved by this, that the book was there. However, they were not of the only opinion. The neighboring country was ruled by a tyrant who dedicated most of the gross national product to the development of weapons, this not being an unusual in the last several thousand years. And he was very envious of this country where the leader got such good advice and the people got such good advice that he was afraid to invade the country, though he was very, very jealous of all the riches he saw in the neighboring country. Well, as happens to all of us, no matter how wise, one night, the old man died. And in the morning, the students found him, and they were thrown into consternation. One half of them thought that they should, of course, after appropriate burial and ceremony, break into the safe and get the book, because they were the students of the teacher, and therefore entitled. And after all, how was the wisdom to be carried forward? On the other hand, the other group of students thought that the old man must have known that he was going to die during the night, and therefore he knew the book would be locked away and they should just leave it alone. Meanwhile, spies had made their way back to the tyrant. The tyrant, upon hearing this, decided to attack immediately. His horde, his army, descended upon the city and descended upon the school, killing the students and having the safe blasted open. One of his generals stepped forward to get the book, and the tyrant, wondering what the power of the book was, thinking perhaps even touching the book would impart certain power, pushed his general aside, pulled the book out himself, broke off the lock, flipped open the pages to behold a blank book. He ruffled the pages forward and backward, hundreds of them. All of them were blank, except save the first one, on which were written these words and these words only. O student, know the beginning of wisdom is to know the difference between the container and the contained. Or in the words of Rumi, look not upon my countenance, but take what is in my hand. Thank you for a good day.